Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to talk about Ann Pamela Cunningham, who became an unlikely heroine in saving Mount Vernon from ruin. In order to tell her story, we need to get a little bit earlier in time to get the backstory. That story, of course, begins with the man pictured here, George Washington. Following his death in 1799, the generations of his descendants that followed had trouble keeping up with the maintenance and preservation of the estate. Washington's once pristine residence and the well kept gardens and grounds suffered over time. One of the problems was tourism. In the early 19th century, they arrived unannounced and traipsed around the estate, and it was in visible decay. The main house had been built a century earlier, required significant funding to maintain 21 rooms, 11,000 square feet of space. The land, which once provided an ample source of income to maintain the house and the rest of the property, had been carved up by various inheritances over the decades from its original 8,000 acres to only 1,200 acres. Meanwhile, overplanting depleted the once fertile soil. Short story revenues were hard to come by to take care of such a large house. Now, in 1841, we take a look at this man. This is John Augustine Washington III, the great grandnephew of President Washington. He took over the daily operations of the estate from his widowed mother. John Augustine soon discovered the limits of what could be done, and he entered into a variety of schemes to raise money. It included selling wood trinkets carved from trees cut from the property to pay the bills. It wasn't working. He was trying his best, but it wasn't working. Pressure to sell the estate was high. In fact, the sale of Mount Vernon had been a hotly debated topic for years. As early as 1843, one newspaper reported the house, the tomb, and the grounds were available for purchase. Though this particular report proved to be a rumor, speculators were interested in the property. In his 1916 book titled Mount Vernon, Washington's Home and the Nation's Shrine, historian Paul Wilstach stated that Washington rebuffed entreaties by private parties as early as 1848 and turned down offers for as much as $300,000, which, by the way, is about $11 million if you adjust it today for inflation. Wilstach noted that Washington declined to sell to speculators because of, quote, a higher sense of its patriotic national quality, end quote. Washington signaled his willingness to the federal government and to the state of Virginia to take ownership. He was open to negotiating any deal that would place Mount Vernon and the property in the hands of the government with the idea that they could care and preserve it for all those generations of tourists that were to come. But the antebellum federal government was smaller and limited in its scope. It wasn't prepared to provide public money to acquire and care for Mount Vernon. The idea of federal funds and a governmental framework to support the acquisition and preservation of national historic sites would not really take shape until the early 20th century. So Washington was about a half a century ahead of his time in that way. The federal government declined to take action, and so did Virginia. Still, Washington held out hope for some lifeline from the government. And while he waited, help arrived from an unexpected source. Now, this is where we get to Ann Pamela Cunningham. She was in her mid 30s in the early 1850s. When she was in her teens, back home in South Carolina, she had become involved in riding horses, a passion for her. There was an accident. She hurt herself and had chronic pain and made periodic trips to Philadelphia. In fact, spent a lot of time in Philadelphia getting treatments from progressive medical doctors in the city. Her mother, Louisa, routinely traveled by steamboat from South Carolina to Philadelphia to visit her daughter and make sure she was getting the care that was needed. On one of those trips in 1853, the return trip from Philadelphia to South Carolina, Anne's mother, Louisa, was on board a steamer and passed by Mount Vernon and noticed how dilapidated the main house and how shabby looking the grounds had become. She saw this from the ship. So you can imagine if she was close up, what it might have even looked worse. So she wrote a letter to her daughter explaining that, gosh, it was in bad shape and suggesting that something should be done to save Mount Vernon from ruin. Louisa, the mother, later recalled, quote, I was painfully distressed at the ruin and desolation of the home of Washington, and the thought passed through my mind. Why was it that the women of this country did not try to keep it in repair if the men could not do it? It does seem such a blot on our country, end quote. Now, Anne acted on her mother's suggestion. On December 2nd, 1853, not too long before Christmas, a call to action was published, signed by her, not by her name, but as the Southern Matron in the Charleston Mercury. Here's a little passage from that original report. Quote, Ladies of the South, can you be still with closed souls and purses while the world cries shame upon America and suffer Mount Vernon with all its sacred associations to become, as is spoken of and probable, the seat of manufacturers and manufactories, noise and smoke and the busy hum of men, destroying all sanctity and repose around the tomb of your world's wonder? Oh, it cannot be possible. That's Cunningham's appeal, aimed at strong Southern women with money and capitalizing on fears that Northern industrialists will come in and take over the land and make Mount Vernon no more. Her message, that original message, ignited passions and launched a movement. She eventually went to John Augustine Washington with a proposal that she would form an organization that would lately take control of the property. In fact, she said to Washington, hey, you all sell the property to my organization, which she eventually called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, or the MVLA. Sell it to me, and we will take the transfer. We'll hold the property as something of a trust. In fact, she was suggesting a nonprofit organization that would care for the property. Washington was skeptical. John Augustine Washington, skeptical at first, eventually realized that, in fact, this was the lifeline that he had been waiting for. He agreed in principle to the idea, and Ann Cunningham drafted a bunch of folks, a bunch of women, and they set about the business of fundraising. A few years went by. In March of 1858, Virginia's House of Delegates had granted a charter to the MVLA, and they authorized the purchase of Mount Vernon with 106 yeas and 2 nays. And the Virginia Senate unanimously approved the bill for the MVLA to purchase Mount Vernon. A month later, Cunningham as the regent, assisted by her vice regents and lawyers, met with Washington in Richmond, Virginia, and sealed the deal. They agreed to a purchase price of $200,000, a down payment of $18,000, and 4 years to pay the balance. Cunningham and the nonprofit MVLA continued to raise funds so they could pay off Washington. They attracted at least one major donor, statesman Edward Everett, who contributed $10,000 to the cause that first year of fundraising in 1858. Everett would later write of the first president, quote, "Washington was the greatest of good men and the best of great men." Students of the Civil War know Everett as the man who turned out to be the warm-up act for another president, Abraham Lincoln, at the dedication ceremony of the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg in November 1863. Back to Cunningham. The sale of Mount Vernon relieved Washington of a heavy burden that would unquestionably have ended with the loss of the house and financial ruin that had hung over the family for several generations. In the sale, Washington also achieved his higher aim to preserve Mount Vernon for Americans to visit and pay tribute to his great-granduncle. Cunningham served as regent of the MVLA from its inception to 1874, when she resigned due to declining health. She died the next year. So the next time you see a photo of Mount Vernon or a visit, think of Ann Pamela Cunningham. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.